We're going to go ahead and get started. It is so fantastic to see you all here. My name is Leah Frieden. I'm the Assistant Manager of the Adult and Reference Services at the Fayetteville Public Library, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all here today. Welcome to those who are watching at home through live stream. We're so excited to have partnered with the Ozark Society for today's event. Before you leave, please do take a moment to fill out the evaluations that we've left for you. Those help us to plan for future programs. And please help me welcome Marvin Schwartz.
Leah, thank you so much. Thank you to the Fayetteville Public Library for this wonderful room and the opportunity to share a landmark event in the history of our organization and in the body of published work concerning a very important topic we all hold dear, which is the Ozark culture, the people, the mountains, and this land that we cherish. To give you a little background, I want you to know there's a couple levels of why this is a historic moment. The Ozark Society, which is your sponsor and your host, was started 60 years ago. 50 years ago, 10 years later, the Ozark Society Foundation was started as a development arm to the Society. And the two organizations, the Society and the Foundation, worked side by side, doing great work in the three tenets of the mission: education, conservation, and recreation. So I'm sure many of you have been on great floats, have raised your voices and contacted elected officials, and been to seminars or programs or classes where your acumen has been raised. The organization has been benefited by a lot of contributions of wonderful people along the way. I'm going to mention one or two just in passing, particularly a gentleman that's sitting in the back row named Ken Smith, we recognize. A trail builder and a trailblazer in his own way, and the author of one of the landmark books on this topic, the Buffalo River Handbook, which has been a supporting element of the society for many, many decades. So people have given a lot of themselves and their heart to the organization, but there were two nonprofits. And it came to a point where I was the president of the foundation, and then we have the organization of the society where there was an overlap and there was financial confusion, and we're both working for the same goals but sometimes bumping into each other. So this year, just in the past few months, the two organizations have merged, and the Ozark Society Foundation has become part of the Ozark Society. Now what this means today is that for the past 60 years, the foundation has been publishing books that contributed to those values that we mentioned. This, Letters to Dan, is the last imprint of the Ozark Society Foundation. So from now on, all books will be just Ozark Society. Same folks, same activity, but we're coming to a milestone point in our history. And that takes us to the launching of the Sassafras Award, which is another milestone event. About 2 years ago, the foundation thought of a way to institutionalize many of the books that we have been producing over the years. And we launched this concept of an award for excellence in environmental writing, which had a criteria, if I could capture it. Anyway, it's a book that identifies a region, could be in this state, in this region, and it appreciates the values with a unique and fresh voice. That was open to any body of work other than scientific writing, including a book that may have already been published, as well as an unfinished manuscript. We expressed that opportunity across the region and received quite a few manuscripts. In the process of a committee, we engaged a key person in this process. I'd like to recognize Davis McCombs of the University of Arkansas, the Creative Writing Program, who was our finalist judge. His judge's statement is in the book, and he agreed with the committee as the manuscripts passed up the line that this was the one to be selected. So with the help of our partners, we're here today. I'd like to recognize, of course, the Highlands chapter, who is your host for this wonderful reception. Brian Thompson, who's the president of the Ozark Society, who's going to be taking on the Society's going to be taking on a lot of work from the foundation, which includes the next round of the Sassafras Award, a youth grants program that has been going for 3 years, recognizing schools and nonprofits that engage young people in environmental hands-on activity. And I think I'm going to leave the rest of it unsaid. There's a lot of terrific people in the room who've done work for a long, long time. So we have our first winner of the Sassafras Award. And this takes us to an introduction of the man of the hour, Don, who's no stranger to this community and an author of several books of his own and in partnership, including with his partner, Sabine Schmidt, who's in the room, and we recognize her contribution to the work that we all share. This is Don's fourth book. The most recent is called Remote Access, and with Sabine is a photography essay of vernacular architecture, schools and libraries in this region. There have been a book called Not a Good Sign and another book called The Buffalo Creek Chronicles. So Don has been on the scene for many years. He's been photographing excellent past and present elements of the Ozark culture. And so in the selection process, we were looking for that unique regional voice. And I think we were extraordinarily pleased to find this manuscript. It came to us, by the way, in a much more abbreviated version. We were submitted 10 essays. By their merit, they rose to the short list and were selected. And then when we contacted Don, he said, oh, by the way, I've got 14 more. Can you give me a couple of months to get there in various stages of completion? And he said, oh, by the way, there's photos also. So we were very accommodating and glad to take this to the next level. So what we have today is subtitled The Philosophical Guide to the Ozarks. But this is no genteel journey through the bucolic hills of the past. You'll find, even in the soft-spoken persona of the narrator, there's some strong language. There's some accusations. If your truck or your dog is in the wrong place, you might meet someone who's very upset about that and will tell you and share his comments with you. So with that, I'm going to ask Don to step up. We have his actual Sassafras Award. There's a cash prize that goes with the publication opportunity. So it's my honor to present you with that.
Thank you. Wow.
Turn the program over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Is this working? Everyone here? Wow, I've been waiting for this. You know, typically a crowd like this would be pretty intimidating to me, but when I look out, I'm seeing all these friends and family, and all the people even I don't know are looking at me friendly, which makes it a lot easier. You know, when I told my granddaughter Rayla that I was a little apprehensive about the crowd, and she suggested I do that typical thing of picturing all of you naked, you know. So I tried that, I just tried that, and I realized actually I've seen quite a few of you naked already. And I have photographic proof, you know, like this. So that's pretty distracting, actually. So my suggestion is that we flip this. So you picture me naked, and then knowing that you're doing that will keep me on track. I think we'll do it. Behind the podium. Behind the podium, you're right. Well, I do want to thank Marvin. Marvin still has a sense of humor, which surprises me, because he acted as the editor for this book. And he discovered that I had absolutely no sense of humor about changing a single word in the manuscript or even a comma. But he stuck to his guns, and his editing and his suggestions really did make it a better book in the end, and I'm grateful for that. And Davis McCombs, the juror, may not realize this, but he actually is the reason why the book was finished. Because after those first 10 essays, I seriously was considering just taking the award money and disappearing to the islands or something and living a life of debauchery and excess for a while. But his good words made me finish it up. And the Ozark Society, you hosted it. If you're not a member of the Ozark Society, I would strongly urge you to consider it. Even if you don't want to hike or go to meetings or float, your dues support an organization that has been fighting the good fight for over half a century. Of course, starting with keeping the Buffalo from becoming a lake full of jet skis, but continuing that for the next 50 years. If you believe that these places we love are now protected, then you're capable of a level of naivete that is matched only by my own. They're under constant threat. And the Ozark Society, along with others, of course, have protected the buffalo against hog farms and landfills and defective sewer plants. And right now, as we speak, the Forest Service is getting ready to do some pretty awful stuff in the upper Buffalo watershed involving burning and herbicides that the Ozark Society is trying to negotiate them out of. I'm very grateful for that. So please support them any way that you can. Marvin suggested that I tell a joke to try to warm the crowd up. And actually, I told him with this particular crowd that it might actually be more effective if I were just simply to remind you of how recently our state legislature, in their great wisdom, has declared war on our beloved libraries and librarians. I figured that would warm you up a little bit, better more, you know. But I do have a joke. It's a library joke. It's the only one I know. It was actually originally told by Myron Cohen, a comedian back in the 1960s, so I figure you've forgotten the joke by now. So a man is working at a large corporation in New York and feels pretty stagnant, and one day the boss calls him in and recognizes his great work and gives him a promotion to vice president and a huge raise, and then tells the man that at his house that night the boss is having a big dinner party for the board of directors and all of the upper management to meet this new vice president. So guy goes home and tells his wife he's thrilled, of course, but he's also very nervous about this dinner because he feels like he's out of his league. The boss lives in a mansion in the wealthiest part of town. The guy doesn't know what to wear. He's afraid he doesn't know what to talk about. He's going to make a fool of himself. But his wife talks him down and convinces him that everything is going to go fine. So off they go that evening. And it's wonderful. The people are great. The food is great. The wine is flowing. Conversations all around the table. They're talking about everything. Art, music, religion, politics, everything. It's just fantastic. Well, while they're talking about music, one of the guests says, you know, I just want to say that Mozart is my favorite composer. Every time I hear his music, it just reaches in and slaps my soul, you know. Well, the new vice president speaks up and says, oh, I know exactly what you mean. Mozart is my favorite composer as well. You know, in fact, I just saw him the other day. You know? Yeah, he was on the 15th Street bus. He was on his way to the library. Well, as you can imagine, the room goes dead, you know. People are trying not to laugh. It's very awkward. But the boss graciously changes subject and off they go. But later, when they get in the car after the dinner, the wife turns to him and says, I can't believe you did that, you know. I mean, things were going so well, and then you had to open your mouth and say something so incredibly stupid that it embarrassed everyone in the room. You know the 15th Street bus doesn't go to the library. Okay. That's pretty good. Myron Cohen. Well, I'm going to go to this first slide if this works. If we could, yeah, we're going to drop these. I want to introduce you to Carl. I know. This is Carl after he had a minor surgery. Now, Carl shows up throughout the essays in this book, my old dog, Carl. I am not going to read you the essay on Carl, this story, because if I did, we would all be weeping uncontrollably, and we'd have to take a break and go to Maxine's and get a couple drinks, you know. Now, I know half of you just thought, what's wrong with that? It sounds great, you know that. Yeah. Well, the only reason we're not is that Maxine's is closed on Sunday, or I would probably take a chance with it. But Carl does show up. And so I'll introduce you to this other handsome animal here. This is Dan Kestelen, Dan of Letters to Dan. And some of you may recognize him. He was here. This is about 30-year-old photograph. He was a photographer here in Fayetteville. He worked as a stringer for the Times. And we became good friends. He was what I would call the old school kind of black and white documentary street photographer, did wonderful work. And then he decided to go off to Ohio and become a Quaker minister, went to the Quaker seminary. I don't think they use the word minister, but something like that, chaplain. And we started a correspondence that was unique in the sense that I would write long letters to Dan, and he would never answer them. But it was actually a very positive thing. I mean, he was not a letter writer because it allowed me to write without distraction. And it turns, I hate to say this in front of Davis McCombs because it'll peg me as an amateur immediately, but I can only write if I'm writing to someone. I literally have to think in those terms. And it has to be someone with whom I can be totally honest. If I were in a course of Davis's and he gave me an essay assignment, if he looked closely, there'd be somebody's name penciled at the top of it other than mine. It would be the person I'm talking to. And it has to be, and Dan is one of those people. I could say anything to him. I could use any language that Quakers normally don't hear on a routine basis, probably. I could make fun of his Quaker religion. I could do anything. And that allowed me to write without the distraction of him asking me questions or telling me about his life. And so all of these letters, all of these essays or stories in the book, all started as letters to Dan. And I mean, I'm grateful to Dan, but I also think I've paid him back. I mean, how many people can get their photograph in a book for doing nothing? I mean, for doing absolutely nothing. I hope you guys like being read to as much as I do. I'd like to read you a couple stories about, they're both about people that I love, people I've met in the Ozarks and have touched me in some way. And this first one is, well, I would just suggest that everybody just kind of relax and lay back and just kind of imagine that we're in a nice room. There's a fireplace, a wood stove, you've got a beverage of some sort nearby, and somebody who dearly loves you is reading out loud to you. This first story, this is a photograph from Lost Valley. I'm sure many of you have seen this. It sits kind of in the entrance to Lost Valley. And this first story is about a woman named Alice Andrews. And some of you may know her, an artist. She was a member of Phoenix here in Fayetteville, and she also a member of Art Ventures here, a wonderful painter. There are two Alice Andrews in the Ozark Society. One lives in Little Rock and one lives here in Boxley. So to keep our Alice straight, we nicknamed her Boxley Alice, and that's the name of the story. Timing is everything. Whether you enjoy that bucolic scene of rolling green pasture with prancing horses, or remember with sadness and resentment the mature forest it replaced, depends on when you arrive, how long you've been watching. I'm thinking of this as I pull into the newly constructed parking lot, big enough for 100 cars or more. The entrance road has been relocated from its original route in front of the small cabin I would always stop to photograph. An image of that cabin in a sea of jonquils ended up in a national magazine years ago. I remember the editor asking me for something that represented spring in the Ozarks. No problem, I replied, and drove to Lost Valley. The new road leaves the cabin sitting far off in an empty field, looking even more forlorn than before, not just temporarily uninhabited, but now forgotten and abandoned, without even the illusion of possible restoration or repair. Visitors by the thousands passing by, the drivers not even noticing. Only the child in the back seat, eyes eager to explore, will see the roof starting to collapse, the saplings pushing through the foundation. And when she returns in a few years with her own children and passes that spot, she will remember, or think she remembers, a cabin on her left. It becomes a ghost, solid in the memories of some, diaphanous and confusing to others, until all of those who ever saw the cabin join the generations who ever lived in it and disappear. I have come today to talk to Alice Andrews. I have come at this particular time, an hour before sunset, on this particular winter day, when a cold front, along with plummeting temperatures, is predicted to hit later this evening, so I can mimic her final hours. Last month, Alice's body was found by hikers in the dry bed of Clark Creek, a short distance off the main trail. I spoke by phone to a friend who lives nearby, and he told me the first responders had hypothesized that Alice went hiking late in the day, left the trail, somehow lost her glasses, and without them was unable to find her way back to the trail and perished from hypothermia. I surprised him by laughing out loud. It wasn't so much that I doubted their conclusion as much as it was that if true, it was exactly the kind of predicament Alice might find herself in. I say this with some authority because Alice and I have gotten confused and lost together more than a few times. Alice and I go back 30 years back, and our first meeting was a series of miscommunication and confusion. Ken Smith was leading a hike into Dug Hollow, one of the rugged tributaries in the upper Buffalo Wilderness area. I met Alice during that slow dance that takes place on Ozark Society hikes, as we all shift our places in the moving single-file line to be able to talk to someone in particular, or to avoid talking to someone in particular, or to pause for a bathroom break, or to just be alone. I tend toward the latter, but during lunch we ended up near each other and discovered our shared freelance artist lives. Alice had a warm, honest, and engaging personality, and I found myself opening up to her questions much more than I would normally. She was from El Dorado, in the south of the state, where speech and mannerisms are much more like Mississippi or Georgia than the Ozarks. She had that wonderful, slow southern drawl that to outsiders can make men sound like morons, but women sound profound and sexy. My three-letter name, Dawn, was drawn out to 3 syllables. She excused herself to go talk to Ken, and when I next looked up from my sandwich, I saw him crouched on the ground beside her as she unfolded a large topo map to ask him something. I reached for my camera and quickly photographed the two of them in that pose, Sensei and Grasshopper, on a warm winter day in the wilds of the Buffalo River country. A week or so later, I developed the film and printed an 8x10 of that image and sent it off to her with my compliments and a short note about enjoying our conversation and recognizing our mutual respect and admiration for Ken. At the next scheduled hike, I arrived late as usual to find the regular crew all standing around and looking at me smirking. As I approached, Alice broke away from the group, came running, and launched herself into my arms. Apparently, something in that long conversation on the trail and the gift that followed came across as a declaration of love. It was horribly embarrassing for both of us, as I was figuring out what must have happened, and she was realizing that her enthusiasm was not being reciprocated at the same intensity. The rest of the day was slightly awkward, as we both pretended that nothing had happened, and of course nothing had. We never spoke of it again, but it began a strong friendship that remained solid, even if visits were sporadic in nature. There was a mutually acknowledged attraction, but the timing was off, and it could never be acted on. I think Alice and I developed a reputation in the Ozark Society during those years for being late and often getting lost. I wish I could say it was undeserved. Once we separately arrived an hour late for a hike into Bowers Hollow in the upper river area. There were 10 or 12 centimeters of new snow on the ground, and the others had gone on, not even aware we were coming, their tracks heading off into the woods. We followed easily and expected to catch up soon, but our pace slowed as we conversed. Alice didn't talk about the weather. Within seconds of starting, she was deep into an analysis of the European approach to helping support artists, providing them with affordable health care at least, rather than our own country's contradictory and hypocritical approach to the arts and artists that left Alice, like every other artist I knew, basically without insurance most of their lives and just hoping for the best until Medicare kicks in at age 64. Not easy to walk fast while having that conversation. Later, we were giggling like children as we tracked the group ahead of us, following a detour as one person broke off and somewhat obviously went to take a leak. Then the lunch spot where everyone sat for a while, and we tried to identify each person by the imprints of their butts in the snow. When we returned to the cars, everyone else had already gone home. One of the best hikes ever. We celebrated with a quick pasta dinner at her house and a few too many glasses of cheap red wine. Happiness and joy are not the same. Joy is episodic. On another trip to the White River Refuge near Brinkley to look for the ivory-billed woodpecker, Alice and I made the mistake of driving together. For the next 3 days, we routinely failed to see the other cars in the caravan turn off toward a canoe launch site, and we would sheepishly find them again an hour or so later. One of the others told me they were speculating we were doing it on purpose to have some romantic time together. But alas, no, it was just two very easily distracted friends, laughing and talking and enjoying each other's company. Sometimes, when people speak of her death, they mention the fact that she started her walk so late in the day, only an hour before dark, as if it were an indication of carelessness or even stupidity. Alice would start a hike at that time simply because she was an artist, and that is when the light becomes magical, when everything changes in that light, when the beeches and oaks and moving water and limestone and sandstone and understory come to life in a whole different way. After all the other visitors have gone back to their vehicles and gathered their children and started home, Alice would have come to walk, to take notes, to gather ideas for paintings, to verify something she remembered from an earlier visit. And there is a good chance that Alice would not have left the main trail as speculated, but rather would never have been on it in the first place. She loved exploring creek beds, and may well have entered Clark Creek dry this time of year, starting right at the parking lot, and never left it, just slowly making her way upstream. In that late evening light, as the limestone that fills the creek bed takes on the tonality of human skin, I have often stood waiting, camera on tripod, shutter release cable in hand, for those 180 seconds of amazement when the light seems to come from within, from inside stone, or from inside the human body. Every artist knows this. When the Roman poet Ovid, 2,000 years ago, described the sculpted marble statue Galatea coming to life in front of besotted Pygmalion, he was alluding to this phenomenon of which I speak. I look up from the viewfinder in total disbelief. Personal experience and observation have shown me that the chances of me capturing it on film are vanishingly small, but the chances of Alice returning to her studio and capturing that essence on canvas are foregone conclusion. She was that good. For someone who doesn't believe in magic in the classical sense of the word that implies the supernatural, I find myself using it often when trying to describe this Boxley Valley, which Alice loved, and in which she lived for so many years. Perhaps a good indicator is that a week ago I was hiking not far from this very spot when I saw a woman in the distance off trail walking up a rugged hollow with her dog. It so looked like Alice, the age, the body, the hair, the gait. I stopped and stared, regretting not having my field glasses with me. I realized at some point that my brain was not concentrating on the impossibility of it being Alice, but rather on whether that was really her dog or not. And my decision not to run toward her calling out Alice's name was based not on fearing I would scare the living hell out of her if it wasn't, but rather not wanting to intrude on her private time if it was. Welcome to Boxley Valley, I reckon. While I spend much time here at the southern boundary of the upper wilderness area, I have not been to this valley within a valley, Lost Valley, for years, hence my astonishment at the changes that the Park Service has made. Being a lifelong adherent to the don't fix it if it ain't broke school of philosophy, I'm not amused, but I'm also not responsible for figuring out how to effectively deal with amazing increases in visitation to the national park, fueled by the pandemic and the horrors of social media and the availability of GPS coordinates. Stop at any trailhead or canoe launch in the park, and the license plates of the cars tell a story of change, of a loss of the decades-long secret. Lost Valley is clearly no longer lost. The premise that the more people who know of a place, the greater the chance they will want to protect it, is hardwired into the belief system of the conservation movement. But love can be stifling. There is such a thing as death by a million visits. Today, due to my midweek arrival, the cold, and the late hour, there are only 2 vehicles in the half-acre lot. No one is in sight as I start up the trail. It feels as if I am entering through a portal into another dimension as soon as the parking lot is out of sight. There is a quiet spirituality here in the non-religious, non-human contaminated sense of that concept. something older than we are, maybe something to do with the hidden caves and tunnels in the sedimentary rock beneath my feet that move water in mysterious ways. Waterfalls cascade over bluffs, then disappear before my eyes. Clark Creek itself runs hidden underground for much of its traverse through the valley. There are secrets here. It can feel as if there are mushroom-like mycelia that spread their arms and fingers throughout the darkness of porous limestone, only lifting their fruiting bodies above ground, the beeches, oaks, hickories, and cedars, according to a schedule that does not consider Homo sapiens in its calculations. There is an energy here that can recharge the human battery, focus the mind, recalibrate priorities. There are reasons why Alice the woman, Alice the artist, walked here over and over. She needed it. She relied on it. The maintained trail runs for about 1.5 miles, but within the first quarter I see a beach at the edge of the creek. It's old and beautiful and is hollowed at the base as beaches are wont to do. The hollow is a black shadow on the light gray of the bark. I know Alice would have stopped here. She would never have been able to pass that tree without a closer look. So I walk over, place my arms around it as I am wont to do when no one is watching, then drop into the creek bed. I sit on a large flat slab of limestone. The creek is dry here now, the water rushing beneath me unseen. I lie down and put my ear to the stone, hoping to hear the water, but it's keeping its secrets. I have brought a thermos of tea and I pour a cup, button up my vest against the penetrating cold, and talk to Alice. I tell her a bawdy joke that Ken Smith told me recently. Fill her in on art news, tell her how much she has missed, chide her for leaving us too soon. I tell her that when told of her death, Ken responded, "A gentle and dreamy soul, not entirely of this world." As wonderful a compliment for an artist as any I've ever heard. And I tell her that her nickname, Boxley Alice, is now being used as a verb, as in, I hope I Boxley Alice it when it's my time to go. I know she would be amused. In the middle of our conversation, I hear voices moving down the trail. A family of 5 comes into view. A man and woman with 3 children between the ages of 5 and 10 walk past me. They are wearing bright colors and loudly talking and yelling at times. "Lily, get back here and stay with us." Or, "Jeremy, put that down right now." I'm sitting within 10 meters of them, yet they're oblivious to my presence. Except the quiet girl, the oldest of the children. She is walking behind the rest. I can see a calmness in her. She has been affected by this place. Her eyes are drawn to the beach, and then she sees me, and her step falters briefly. I raise my fedora in a kind of greeting to a kindred spirit. Our eyes stay locked until our views are blocked by the beach. A few seconds later, I hear her voice for the first time. "There was a man," she says. But the only response I can hear is her mother loudly telling Jeremy that his butt is going to be sore if he doesn't change his attitude. She will remember this moment for the rest of her life, I am sure of that. I may change in her telling of it from man to fairy to ghost to ogre, depending on her audience and her mood, but her memory of the place will bring her back someday. Without saying anything to her companions, she will look over when she recognizes the hollow beach, then look beyond to the creek bed, and she will smile to herself when she realizes that she actually believes I could still be there. And perhaps I will be. Timing is everything. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. You're very kind. Very kind. Did a lot of you know Alice Andrews by chance? Yeah. Ah, that is quite a few. This last story is about Ken Smith. And Marvin has already given a good introduction for Ken. The first book that Ken wrote, The Buffalo River Country, is the book that I discovered when I first came to Arkansas. It was written in 1967, and it was written at a very critical time in the fight to save the buffalo. And people who were there at the time all agreed that it was pivotal in convincing people what needed to be saved. It showed the people enjoying the buffalo for the first time. It showed the human and natural history, and it gave politicians and people out inside the state and outside a chance to see what the fuss was all about. It was a big deal. And that book, by the way, the Ozark Society, is reprinted, and it's still available. And I reread it all the time. You know, when you look at what I love about the photographs, the photographs represent a different time. That most of us in this room know this time when you could actually float a river in an aluminum canoe and be perfectly happy. You know, you didn't have to have the water being wicked away from your body by technical fabrics. You could actually just wear a t-shirt and go down the river and have a good time. And I love the pictures of Ozark Society members floating. Well, Ken, as you know, is trail building, and he wrote another book, the Buffalo River Handbook, which has become my Bible that I take whenever I go to the river. And this story is about Ken at that time that he's writing the book. And this photograph was taken at Buffalo Point Campground the night before we started afloat. Ken's eating his Spartan dinner at the table, and this tree, this beautiful tree, when I got home and developed this and made this print, I realized I didn't identify that tree. I didn't know what it was. So I called back to the park and got a wonderful ranger on the phone, and she said that she knew the tree but didn't know what it was either. And she ran down there and identified it and came back and told me it's a box elder. And this is called the Master. And Ken, I know he's here. I'm hoping he didn't hear me say that, because he would not like being called the Master. He's very self-deprecating that way. But I am sitting at the kitchen table in my cabin. It's early spring 2001, still cold, and the wood stove is blazing. Wet clothing and gear are spread out on every available surface to dry. I'm hungry, just back from 3 days and nights on the Buffalo River. I have made an iron skillet full of fried potatoes and onions, my entry back to civilization's standard fare. Garrison Keillor's Prairie Home Companion program is murmuring low on KUAF public radio. At the start of an old gospel tune, one I remember my mother singing, I start weeping. It has nothing to do with religion, or my mother for that matter. It has to do with the man I have spent the last 3 days with, and the emotional roller coaster he made me ride. Over 30 years after the first publication of his book, Buffalo River Country, Ken Smith is working on an update. 150 miles of trails and side trails have been built under his supervision. Put-ins and takeouts have been established. Millions of visitors have floated and hiked the corridor. He surprises me with a phone call asking if I will consider floating the lower section from Buffalo Point to the White River so he can finish some research. He needs someone in the bow of the canoe to help paddle. A writer, Jason Harmon, and a photographer, Philip Walred, are to join us to document the trip for a possible magazine article. Ken makes it clear that I will not be there as photographer, but only as brawn. I have a focused, so to speak, purpose. I'm not offended. I jump at the chance. I meet Ken at the Buffalo Point Campground on a cold, late March afternoon. Jason and Philip are running late. So Ken and I set up our tents and eat a cold and rather Spartan supper. As we each open our lidded containers, we're amused by how closely our meals match. Boiled eggs, carrots, bulgur, trail mix. I've added 3 Cadbury chocolate caramel Easter eggs to my cache. And we will end up sharing them at each supper, carefully cutting them in half, our own little ritual of friendship on the gravel bars. We are the only campers in sight, but Buffalo Point is large, and we begin to worry that our companions have camped in another section. It's totally dark as we begin to walk around the perimeter, checking at various campsites. 2 men walking and talking in the dark, in the way that men can talk only when faces are hidden. It's slow and easy, and I feel I'm getting to know this man better and liking him more and more. We only use our headlamps when we feel ourselves drifting off the pavement, content not to break the spell of darkness, the murmur of our voices. An hour or so later, the others show up, and we sit by candlelight discussing the next day's schedule. Ken pulls a worn topo map covered with his carefully inscribed notes and points out the places he needs to explore. It involves lost cemeteries. Lost in the sense that no burials have taken place in them for nearly a century, and their locations known vaguely only by former residents that Ken has interviewed over the years. He needs to find them, the first clue that he's not working on a typical guidebook. Later, I slip into my tent wearing everything I brought with me against the cold. Long johns, top and bottom, t-shirt, shirt, wool sweater, photo vest, jacket, and gloves. I make my first entry in my trip log, a note to self, get a warmer sleeping bag. The next morning, we push off into the current, 2 tandem canoes, Philip and Jason in one, Ken and I in another. We will spend 3 days on the river, floating 31 miles down the lower section to the mouth where it meets the mighty White, and then 6 miles down to the White to Ship's Ferry Landing, where our vehicles will hopefully be waiting. 7 miles downstream from our put-in at Buffalo Point, we will enter the lower Buffalo Wilderness area. There are no takeouts, no roads, no access, no way to abbreviate the trip if something goes wrong, or if the 2 journalist strangers turn out to be poor companions. I ponder these things as I glance back at last night's campsite, but then we're into a sharp bend and out of sight. I am committed, or think perhaps I should be. Excuse me 1 second. Reading out loud. Ken has been researching the Buffalo River for half a century at this point. I'm astonished at his level of knowledge of the human and natural history. He begins a narrative at the first bend in the river and continues it until the end. We pass bluffs and hollows and pools and bends with names like Tony, Bice, Jones, Ludlow, Gage, Bear, Rush, Silver, Laffoon, Cedar, Lonely, Cowhouse, Brantley, Horseshoe, Fish Trap, Cold Spring, Killingsworth, Rose, Woodcock, Caney, Spencer, Leatherwood, Sheep Jump, Spring, Killingsworth, Rose, Woodcock. Sheep Jump, Burr, Cow Creek, and Elephant Head. Ken knows everyone by name like old friends. He knows the people who live there, what happened to them, what happened to their children, whether they died here or moved on to Oklahoma or California. He is not lecturing us. It's more an exercise in remembrance, as if he is dictating out loud the text that will become his new book. And he doesn't think the history of the Buffalo watershed begins with white Europeans whose names appear on the maps, or even with the arrival some 12,000 years before them of the first humans to inhabit the continent. He thinks in geologic time, of how the very rock that is beneath our feet and is exposed on the bluff faces we crane our necks to see is the opening chapter in the history book about our national river. The names are not the same as those in local cemeteries, but Ken knows them all as well. St. Joe, Boone and Platten limestone, St. Peter and Everton sandstone. He pauses to point out things we may have missed: yellow celandine poppy, white corn salad, shooting stars, water leaf, bright red fire pink, morel mushrooms by a musselwood beach, 2 ospreys eating fresh caught fish, a young bald eagle, an otter, a rocked up and developed spring where once a family had run a pipe under and across the river to their cabin, wild turkey, a copperhead, a corn snake, long-nosed gars, smallmouth bass, and where communities once existed, where schools and churches stood. But it's the people. I scribble notes when I can, trying to balance my journal on my paddle between strokes, trying to get the details right, trying to remember. In 1925, a man my age comes home from his fields along the river to find his wife shot to death and his infant grandson dead with his head smashed in with a rock. A day later, in another isolated cabin, a couple is found shot to death. All evidence points to a mentally ill 14-year-old boy who holds another couple hostage until he is captured and sent to reform school, then to prison when he reaches 21 years of age, where he kills his cellmate. According to a woman whom Ken interviewed and who was a child at the time of the original trial, what she most remembered was the boy answering the question of why he had killed the baby, quote, because it was crying and so pitiful, end quote. The boy's family moves to Oklahoma, but years later the father returns to publicly apologize for what his son has done to the community. We reach a gravel bar as light is falling fast. We're behind Ken's schedule. He was hoping to have plenty of light and time to find a cemetery high up on a wooded ridge above the river. His schedule is not rushed, just well planned. He knows that a few hours delay or a turn in the weather can easily morph into needing another night or two on the river, and the implosion of the best-laid shuttle plans and deadlines. The thought of another few days on the river in his presence is appealing to me, and I say so. He barely smiles, then tells me to get on my boots and start climbing. We know there will be no fence, no sign. There has not been a burial for 80 years or more, and it will be full of mature trees by now. Ken only knows where it should be from his interviews with old-timers who grew up along the river. We spread out to cover as much ground as possible and strain to look through the near darkness. The only sounds are our breathing and the crunch of leaves underneath. Jason breaks that silence. "What's this flowering plant, Ken?" Ken takes one look and yells, "Stop! This is it. That is bridal wreath." And suddenly there they are, where nothing had been before, upright sandstone markers. 3 men drop to their knees in front of the stones, touching the rock, looking closely. Only Ken stays on his feet, and I look over to see him making notes in his journal, marks on his map. He looks up at me and says, "Bridal wreath, Spirea prunifolia, non-native. Pioneers planted it in cemeteries." He flips his notebook shut, then starts back down, as the rest of us reluctantly follow in the dark, like puppies. The next day we have a quick breakfast, repack, and head downstream. A man up one of the rugged hollows we pass ran an illegal still that was said by the federal agents who finally shut it down to be the best one they'd ever seen. His product sold in several states. The man was accused of the murder of another man and tried. He hired Little Rock lawyers and denied his guilt, but was convicted. Ken found that the man's guilt or innocence was still being debated all these years later. His appeals were denied, and he was executed in the electric chair, his body delivered to his wife and children to their cabin right here along the river, where we now stand, with our paddles in our hands. Our topo maps pour shields from the misery and grief that once enveloped this hollow. And the final emotional stab of synchronicity. The man who was electrocuted was the grandfather of a good friend of mine. Her name echoes off the water, first as Ken says it, and then again as I repeat it in disbelief. In late afternoon, we reach another bend in the river, and Ken signals us to stop. We fight our way through cane and brambles as he leads us away from the river and into the hardwood bottoms. We're looking for another cemetery, this one even more difficult to locate. Once again, we seem to be searching in diminishing light for clues that don't want to be found. During the Civil War, a small band of Union soldiers are cutting through the area on their way to Yellville and are ambushed by local Confederates. 12 Union and 1 Confederate are killed, and both sides pull back and disappear, the skirmish never recorded. A woman living alone nearby hears the gunfire and goes up to find 13 dead men on the bench above her cabin. With the help of another woman living alone nearby, they drag the bodies to a level spot by the river and bury them, digging graves by hand in the frozen winter ground. We spread out again, walking back and forth, retracing our steps, trying another tack, circling back, starting again. Jason bends down to look at a morel mushroom, and with that difference of angle sees the stones right at our feet, lined up in rows, shallow depressions behind. The soldiers joined by others after the war, a logical spot to add the victims of disease and childbirth and accident. As Ken makes notes, I sit near one of the uninscribed sandstone slabs and can feel the fear of those young men, tripping on rocks, hear their cursing at greenbrier thorns, sweating under wool coats as they walk into the ambush, then the terror of the first shots, friends dropping and dying around them. I wonder if even one of them was still alive when the women arrived, if one young soldier perhaps thought that his mother had found him before all went black. I take no comfort in it, but that image refuses to leave me and will haunt me for months. We camp on a narrow gravel bar not far from the cemetery. It's bitter cold and so windy that we have to help each other set up our tents, then throw backpacks and rocks inside to keep them from disappearing downriver. All of us are hungry and exhausted from the search. As Jason and Philip work on their dinner a few feet away, Ken and I hunker down, using the side of my tent as a windbreak. The power of the wind is so strong that our voices stop a foot away, and we can hear nothing of the conversation of the others. Crouching here, tired and dirty, Eating a meal of beans and stale bread, we could be two lonely soldiers in the dark, talking about home and family and our friends who didn't make it. I questioned him about his life's work here along this river, how he was able to do what he wanted to do, the decisions he must have made about making money or not, a prioritizing of things, the lifestyle he has embraced. I am trying in my clumsy way to tell him that he is a hero of mine, that I so respect those decisions he made, the work he has done, how his example has affected me, how grateful I am that he brought me along on this adventure. Ken does not suffer compliments gladly. He ponders for a long time, and then he says, "You work hard for 50 years, and when you're done, you hope you have something important, something valuable, have done something useful. I have no advice to give you about making money. I have lived a life of thoughtful frugality." Ken then asks me a few questions, and I end up talking about what brought me to Arkansas, why I photograph people, about my mother and her death, and my sister, my niece, my children. I have spoken to others about these same things, but tonight with this man, this storyteller, this historian, it feels as if I'm telling it for the last time, the one that matters, that someday in the future, on a gravel bar along the Buffalo River, Ken will be sitting with a group of people by a campfire. Someone will take out a piece of Cadbury chocolate or show their new camera, and Ken will say, "Have you ever heard of a photographer named Don House? Or perhaps you know his sister Glenda, who taught at the university, or his mother, Anna Jean, who died in 1994. Well, here's an interesting story." Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you. Ken Smith, the master. Well, I will gladly entertain a few questions. I'm going to be signing books later. The Ozark Society has got a table set up there. And if you want to join the society, I'm sure someone would help you with that. The president is here today, which is a good sign. But any questions you have about rivers, photography, relationships? Oh, yes, please.
Tell us about the photograph on the cover of this book.
I was hoping somebody would ask me that question, really. Because this photograph, it'll be explained in volume 2, but it's actually, it is not mentioned. It's not mentioned in the book, or at least no explanation is given for it. But I put it on the cover because it represents a few things. And, when I wrote these stories, I kept in mind something that Ken Smith suggested to me years and years ago when talking to people or writing, letters to the editor or anything. He used the term sweet reasonableness, and I try to keep that in mind. But in the epilogue of this book, I let loose a little bit, and one of the things that I complain about really is that our rivers and our wild areas are turning into geocaching exercises almost, and it's degrading the sites and degrading the experience. And the writer and photographer Zabina Schmidt, who's here today, was introduced earlier. She described it, I thought, beautifully. She said it's what happens when a site changes from discovery to destination. And we can certainly talk more about that. But this photograph is a corollary to that, really, because this was on exhibit years ago locally. And I was standing there as usual, with my glass of wine to answer questions and stuff. And this young man, a photographer, came up. I knew him, and he asked me, he admired the photo, and then he launched into an explanation of how using Photoshop and some readily available free stock photography, he could recreate this image without ever leaving the house. He could get very close to it. And I didn't doubt for a minute that he was right. I'd seen the power of Photoshop. But when he walked away, I just thought, you poor son of a bitch, you just do not get it. I mean, you don't get it. I mean, what went into this photograph, and it has to do with this discovery destination deal. This photograph, this image started as a discovery during a kind of a rugged, steep bushwhacking hike, discovering this pool, this mysterious pool that I'd never seen before. And then sitting there for 2 or 3 hours and watching how it how the water and this amazing sandstone changed as the light changed over the sky, and then coming up with a vision for that photograph, and then going home and calling a woman that I knew had enough of a sense of humor that she would be willing to hike into this area, disrobe, and enter that pool for me. And then the next day, picking her up and heading down 16, and as probably everyone in this room knows, you stop at Hoosh's for breakfast. You stop at the Pig Trail Cafe and have one of Hoosh's veggie omelets and crispy hash browns and one pancake on the side. And a wonderful conversation with this woman, plus being pulled into a conversation at the table next to us, which are the old guys who are there every day, about if you were going to shoot yourself, which caliber would be best to use, you know? It's a wonderful conversation. It's part of it. And then continuing on down 16 through all those wonderful communities, getting to the Buffalo, hiking into this site again, and then watching as this woman disrobes and enters the water, and then experience that phenomenon, which is unique to the Ozarks. I really believe this as a photographer. The human body, the human form, adds a certain, it complements the textures and tonality of the rock and the water in the Ozarks like nowhere else. Out west or in the Appalachians, when I've been there, a nude seems like an intrusion, a distraction. In the Ozarks, it serves a different role. And to see that beautiful thing come together of rock and the textures and tonalities was wonderful. Plus, there was a technical part of being in a very awkward, steep spot. I had to have a rope tied to the tripod so the expensive camera wouldn't go into the water and knock the woman senseless, you know. And then afterwards, you know, sitting there, having lunch that I packed in, this a little, you know, Mediterranean buffet with some wine in a flask, and it was a scene reminiscent of you know, like Afternoon in the Park of Monet or something. It was just wonderful. And then hiking out, and then for me, of course, a few days later, over the next few days, is developing film, and then seeing this image come up for the very first time in Chemicals. Or I could have stayed home and done that on my laptop without ever having to go to the trouble, you know? Any other questions? I promise there'll be a shorter answer. Anything else? Okay, that's it. Well, we will be there. I'll be there. Thank you.